Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Mrs. Jeffries and the Missing Alibi by Emily Brightwell, narrated by Lindy Nettleton. Chapter 1. "Poor bloke," muttered George Hallisham, the night watchman. 25 years married and still waiting for his old mum to leave off and give up. He snorted as his eyes strained in the feeble light to struggle through the article in the Times. He weren't much of a reader, but with there being nothing else to do on these long evenings excepting to make his rounds every hour or so, reading a newspaper was better than sitting here watching the wind tinkle the windows on the front of the building. Not that he liked the Times all that much, but it was the only one he'd been able to dig out of the rubbish bin when he'd come on duty this evening. "Not that the old girl'll give up, not blooming likely," he said, laughing at his own wit. "Queen Victoria won't give up the throne till she's planted 6 feet under." He caught himself and glanced down the hallway. There were still lights on in some of the offices. He'd best watch his tongue. People thought you were strange if they came out and caught you talking to yourself. He sighed and went back to struggling through the article about the silver wedding anniversary of the Prince and Princess of Wales. It was either read that or all that rubbish about the death of the German Emperor. He didn't much care for the Germans. A blast of cold March wind slipped in through the crack under the double front doors, fluttering the single light on the far wall and sending chills up George's spine. He glanced up, and through the glass he could see the thick, damp yellow fog drifting across the deserted, wet street. Nasty night out, he thought, not fit for man or beast. He went back to his paper, turned the page, and then looked up again. Someone was banging on the front door. Blast! George put the paper down and sidled out from behind his cosy nest behind the high wooden counter. Peering through the window, he squinted, trying to decide if he recognized the man standing on the doorstoop. But what with the city being too cheap to keep the one gas lamp outside the building working proper, all he could see was a figure of medium height wearing a bowler hat. "What be your business?" George called through the glass. He'd been told never to open the doors after business hours, not since them break-ins last month. "Open up!" the man yelled. "I'm from Scotland Yard." "What?" The wind blew so loudly he could barely hear the fellow. "Scotland Yard! The police!" the man repeated. George didn't hesitate. He took out his big brass key-ring, unlocked the door and flung it open. "Sorry, sir," he ushered the man inside. "Didn't mean to keep you waiting, but I'm not to open the door after business hours. We've had a few break-ins in the past months. Is that what you're here about?" "That's quite all right," the man said. He wore a large dark overcoat, spectacles, and had a moustache. "No, I'm not here about your break-ins. That's a different department altogether. Is Mr. Hornsley still on the premises?" George strained to hear the policeman's voice, who was standing quite a distance away and had his head down, almost like he was talking to the floor instead of to George. "There's still a light on in his office," he replied, "and I ain't seen him leave yet, so I reckon he's still hard at it. Works hard, Mr. Hornsley does. Sometimes he don't leave until close to midnight." "Which is his office?" The policeman stepped toward the dimly lit hallway. "It's the last door at the end of the hall. Come on, I'll show you." "That won't be necessary. I'm sure I can find my own way." "No, I've got to announce you. It's the rules, you see." "Thank you. I'm Inspector Witherspoon from Scotland Yard." "This way, sir." George shuffled off down the hall. He was dying to know why the inspector was here, but he didn't quite have the nerve to ask. Maybe if he did a bit of chatting. "Miserable night, isn't it, sir?" "Quite." "First the fog," George slowed his steps, "and now all this wind and rain, not fit for man or beast." "No, it isn't." "Must be hard on you fellows, the police I mean, going out at all hours of the day and night," George continued gamely. Ruddy hell, if that fellow kept his chin any lower he was going to trip over it. "Quite." George almost gave up. The copper obviously weren't much of a talker. "Odd you coming round at this time of night, sir. Most of the offices close at past. Course, we do get a lot of clerks and such that have to work late. Makes it hard on me, but most everyone is usually gone by now, excepting, of course, Mr. Hornsley." By this time they'd arrived at the door of the offices of Hornsley, Frampton and Whitelaw, insurance brokers. George knew his curiosity wasn't going to be satisfied. He'd never get a word out of Mr. Hornsley either. Hornsley didn't bother speaking to the likes of George Hallisham. "I'd better announce you, sir. Like I said, people is a bit nervous 'cause of them break-ins." "As you wish." "Mr. Hornsley!" George banged on the door. "You've a visitor, Mr. Hornsley." They waited a moment, but heard nothing. The policeman shouldered the watchman aside. "Mr. Hornsley!" he yelled, loud enough to make George wince. "I'm Inspector Gerald Witherspoon from Scotland Yard. I must speak with you." George glanced quickly at the fanlights above the other office doors. He hoped this screaming policeman didn't disturb anyone else who was working late. From inside they heard a muffled shout. "Just a moment!" "Scotland Yard!" Witherspoon yelled back. "Inspector Witherspoon, do please open up." Poor George thought, glancing anxiously at the fanlights over the other doors again. The bloke's screaming loud enough to wake the dead. If the other tenants were disturbed, he'd hear about it tomorrow, that was for sure. No matter what happened in the evenings, he always got the blame. The door opened, and a middle-aged man with thinning dark hair glared out at them. "What's this all about?" "Sorry to disturb you, sir," the policeman said apologetically, "but I must speak with you. It's rather urgent. You could say it was a matter of life or death." Hornsley opened the door wider and motioned the policeman inside. "Come in, then, though I do hope you'll be brief. I'm very busy." George waited till the door closed behind the two men, debated about the wisdom of trying to eavesdrop, realized it was time to do his rounds, so he grudgingly left. "Now, what's going on?" Hornsley asked, turning and walking toward a patch of light spilling out of an open doorway at the far side of the room. "This won't take long, sir," the inspector said. Except for the light from Hornsley's office, the place was in darkness, but even in the dimness he could see 4 clerks' desks clustered in the centre of the room. As one would expect, there were bookcases and file cabinets as well, but they were nothing more than dark shapes against the walls. High-backed straight chairs were strewn willy-nilly between the desks and the walls. The floor was of plain hard wood, and he suspected the walls were painted an ugly pale green. Typical London office, he thought. No comfort for the clerks except a meagre pay packet at the end of the week. All in all, it looked a miserable place to work. "But we've reason to believe your life is in danger." "You're joking." Hornsley turned and stared at him, his eyes widening in surprise. "We don't jest about murder," Witherspoon replied. He put his hand in his pocket. It was a special pocket designed to hold a much larger object than usual. His fingers curled around the hard leather at the top. "Perhaps we should go into your office and sit down." Yes, of course." Hornsley swivelled about on his heel. The inspector pulled his hand out of his pocket, tightening his fingers around the end of the instrument he withdrew. He paused a moment, making sure that Hornsley's back was to him. Taking a deep breath, he lunged forward just as he lifted his arm and slammed the heavy object hard against Hornsley's skull. "Oh!" Hornsley slumped to his knees and fell forward onto his hands, stunned. From out of his other pocket, the man behind him pulled out a tie. Before Hornsley could come to his senses, the inspector stepped beside him, slipped the tie around his neck, crossed the ends, and yanked with all his might. It was over in moments. The killer knelt beside him, rolled the body over, and checked for signs of life. He smiled, satisfied when he realized that Hornsley was dead. From inside his coat pocket, he pulled out a piece of paper and a straight pin. He pinned the paper to Hornsley's chest. Standing up, he listened for a moment. Then he walked to the door of the outer office, cracked it open, and peeked out. The night watchman was still gone. Walking softly, he hurried to the front door, checked behind him to make sure that no one was there, and then stepped out into the dark and fog. Smythe, the coachman for Inspector Gerald Witherspoon, eyed his quarry warily. Betsy, the maid, had her back turned to him, and for that he was grateful. He was as nervous as a kitten in a pen full of bulldogs. He took a deep breath and gathered his courage.
Betsy."
He cleared his throat. She whirled around, her hand still on the bag of flour she'd just put on the cooling pantry shelf. "What, is tea ready?"
No, he replied. "I was, wondering if you like the zoological gardens."
"The one in Regent's Park?" She smiled. "Who doesn't? They've just added another cat, something called an Ira. I was planning on going to have a look at it sometime soon. Do you want to come with me?" Smythe stared at her incredulously. Here he'd been screwing up his courage for the past week to work up the nerve to ask her to go out with him, and she'd done stole his thunder. He wasn't sure if he should be knocked or happy, but as he was half balmy over the lass, he decided not to look a gift horse in the mouth.
"That's what I was fixing to ask you," he said, grinning. "What say we go next Wednesday?"
"Let's see if we can ask Mrs. Jeffries for Monday instead." Betsy shook her head, sending a blonde tendril slipping off her top knot. "It's half price on Mondays, only 6pence instead of a whole shilling." Smythe opened his mouth to argue, to tell her that the cost of admission was the least of his worries, but then he clamped his lips together. No sense in letting on about how much money he had. It were a big enough trial to him without Betsy getting wind of the fact that he didn't need to be as careful with coin as the rest of the staff. "Tea's ready," he heard Mrs. Goodge yell from the kitchen. Betsy, the hem of her blue broadcloth dress swishing prettily, hurried past him and into the kitchen. He shook his head once, called himself a silly git for being so bloomin' pleased about their outing, and followed her. Mrs. Jeffries, the housekeeper, was just sitting down at the head of the table. She looked up, a kind smile on her lips, as the two of them came into the room. Her hair was a deep, rich auburn, prettily streaked with grey at the temples, and worn in a loose knot on the top of her head. She had dark brown eyes, a round, cheerful face that belied a razor-sharp intelligence, and a short and rather plump stature. Nevertheless, she had the presence of a commanding general when the need arose and when she presided over the evening tea-table. Thump! Mrs. Goodge, the heavy-set grey-haired cook, glared in the direction of the staircase. When is that boy going to learn how to use those crutches properly? Thump. Betsy giggled, her blue eyes twinkling mischievously. He's not got the hang of it yet, she said, reaching for a toasted tea cake. And from the sound of it, I don't think our ears are going to get much of a rest for some time to come. It's not poor Wiggins' fault he broke his ankle, Smythe said loyally. He was a big, muscular man with dark hair and harsh features that were softened by a cocky grin and a cheerful disposition. Thump. Mrs. Goodge snorted. Then whose fault is it? He had no business trying to ride one of them contraptions. But Mrs. Goodge, Mrs. Jeffries interjected, lots of people learn to ride bicycles. It's quite a useful mode of transportation. Wiggins weren't no more interested in transport than he is of learning to read Latin standing on his head, the cook declared. He were just showing off to that girl. Well, Mrs. Jeffries said soothingly, I expect he's going to be more careful in the future. She peered at the cook curiously. Mrs. Goodge had been in a rather irritable state for some time now. Is your rheumatism bothering you? She asked softly. Thump, thump, thump. Bloomin' Ada! Wiggins screeched in alarm. It sounded like he was bouncing down the last 3 stairs. Smythe leapt to his feet. You all right, lad? Fine, Wiggins yelled back. They heard the bang of his crutches as he started down the hall toward the kitchen. Just slipped a bit. My rheumatism's fine, Mrs. Goodge said flatly. Then is something else bothering you? Mrs. Jeffries pressed. She hesitated a moment. I'm bored. We've not had us a decent murder in weeks. What's wrong with this city? Mrs. Goodge! Mrs. Jeffries pretended to be shocked, but only because she thought she ought to for appearance's sake. Her conscience insisted she remind the staff that homicide was a terrible and foul crime. They really mustn't wish it upon anyone. Oh, said Mrs. Goodge, waving a plump white hand dismissively. I didn't mean that in the way it sounded, but you know what I'm trying to say. Life is so much more interesting when we're on a case. I missed the last one, so for me it's been such a long time. I know what you mean, Betsy commiserated with her. It's right boring when we don't have us a good murder to sink our teeth into. If you ask me, Wiggins propped his crutches against his chair and flopped awkwardly into his seat, I think the inspector's doing just fine as he is. Do him good to have a rest. Where is the inspector this evening? Smythe put in. He went upstairs in the study when I was up there filling the lamps. He went for a walk, Mrs. Jeffries replied. The inspector's out on a night like this? Betsy exclaimed. But it's right miserable outside. She shivered and ran her hands lightly up and down her crossed arms. Maybe he's as bored as we are. Now, we've no reason to be complaining, Mrs. Jeffries said quickly. She wanted to head off another discussion about the lack of murders. We've had more than our fair share of investigations. And they had. Inspector Gerald Witherspoon had a phenomenal success as a homicide detective, due in large part to their very secret efforts on his behalf. Not that the dear man had any idea that he was helped by his household staff. Oh, no, that would never do. They worked hard, each and every one, to make sure Inspector Witherspoon was completely in the dark about their activities. Of course, as a consequence of their actions, they were all now thoroughly bored with the normal household routine. Honestly, Mrs. Jeffries sighed inwardly. She didn't want to have to lecture them, but really, they'd done nothing but moan for days about the lack of murders. Even their dear friends Lutybell Crookshank and her butler Hatchet had been complaining about it when they'd come round for lunch today. "Fair share," Mrs. Goodge snorted. "I haven't had my fair share." "But that's not our fault," Wiggins said doggedly. He was an earnest, kind-hearted lad with brown hair and round apple cheeks. "It was your relation that took sick." Mrs. Goodge had been called away to nurse a sick aunt when they had their last investigation, and she hadn't let any of them forget the fact that she'd missed one. "We must be patient," Mrs. Jeffries replied, reaching for the big brown teapot. "I'm sure something will happen soon. Evil sometimes takes a nap, but it never completely disappears." "I say, Mrs. Jeffries." Inspector Witherspoon peered over the rim of his spectacles. His eyes were a clear blue-grey, his face all angles and bone, his hair dark brown and thinning. "This is a jolly good breakfast. I've not had coddled eggs for ages." "Mrs. Goodge thought you deserved something special today, sir," Mrs. Jeffries replied. Actually, the cook was still in a testy mood and taking it out on anyone who happened to step into her kitchen. Wiggins was her usual victim because he, unlike the rest of them, didn't have the good sense to stay out of Mrs. Goodge's way. The only reason the inspector got coddled eggs was because Mrs. Jeffries had cooked them when Mrs. Goodge had gone into the wet larder looking for something to cook for supper. There was a loud banging on the front door. Mrs. Jeffries put down the toast rack. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked Witherspoon. "Not this morning," he replied. Mrs. Jeffries hurried out of the dining room. She flung open the door and found a uniformed policeman standing on the stoop. "Why, Constable Barnes," she said, smiling at the grey-haired, craggy-faced man. "What on earth are you doing here?" "Good morning, Mrs. Jeffries." Barnes gave her a weak smile. "Sorry to be called in so early, but I've got to speak with the inspector. It's rather urgent." "Urgent?" Mrs. Jeffries glanced at Barnes carefully as she opened the door wider and stepped back. The constable's mouth was bracketed with deep lines, and there was an anxious, worried look to his eyes. Something was wrong. Very wrong indeed. "Inspector Witherspoon's having breakfast. Why don't you join him?" Barnes took off down the hall. Mrs. Jeffries was right on his heels. "Good morning, Constable." Witherspoon smiled broadly. "I didn't expect to see you this early. I thought we were meeting at the station." "There's been a change in plans, sir." Barnes took his helmet off and then stared at the teapot. "May I have a cuppa, sir?" "Of course. Mrs. Jeffries, do be kind enough to bring the constable a cup." But she was already snatching one from the supply she kept in the sideboard. She watched Barnes out of the corner of her eye as she poured his tea. He was pale, as though he'd had a great shock. Her first instinct was correct. Something was wrong. "Now," Witherspoon said as soon as the constable sat down with his tea, "what's all this about, then?" "There's been a murder, sir." Barnes looked down at the tablecloth. Mrs. Jeffries brightened. Perhaps she'd been mistaken. Perhaps Barnes's demeanour was only because this murder was particularly loathsome. But her spirit sank almost immediately. Barnes hadn't even raised his head to look the inspector in the eye. She poured herself a cup of tea. "Is that so?" Witherspoon sounded confused, as though he too could sense there was something wrong with the constable. Barnes cleared his throat. "Well, sir, the Chief Inspector wants you to report to the yard right away." "Constable Barnes," the inspector flung his napkin on the table, "I'm getting the sense that there's something you're not telling me. Is something wrong?" Barnes nodded. "A businessman named Peter Hornsley was murdered last night in his offices on Lambeth Street. That's one of the tiny little streets over in the city, sir. He was strangled. "There's nothing particularly odd about that," Witherspoon replied slowly. "People do get murdered, even people in the city. Am I being given the case?" "No, sir, Inspector Nivens is getting it." Barnes's shoulders slumped. "Then why do I need to go and see the Chief Inspector?" Mrs. Jeffries wondered the same thing. "Because, sir," Barnes blurted, "the last person to see Hornsley alive was the policeman, and he called himself Gerald Witherspoon." The instant the door closed behind the two men, Mrs. Jeffries flew down the stairs. Betsy looked up from the basket of linen she was folding as the housekeeper rushed into the kitchen. "There's been a murder!" Mrs. Jeffries cried. Mrs. Goodge shoved the sack of sugar she'd just opened to one side. "It's about time." "Quickly," Mrs. Jeffries said to the maid. "Where is Wiggins?" "He's upstairs in his room," she replied, kicking the basket of linens out of her way. "We gave him the brass to polish." Mrs. Jeffries nodded. With a sprained ankle, the footman wouldn't be much use to them on this case. "Betsy, you must get over to Howard's and get Smythe." "Should we send for Lucy Bell and Hatchet?" Mrs. Goodge asked. "Lucy gets put out if she isn't in right from the start." "Yes, we should. We're going to need all the help we can get on this case." "Should I go then?" Betsy called over her shoulder as she hurried to the coterie. "I can pop round there as soon as I've seen Smythe." "No," the housekeeper shook her head. "We need everyone back here as soon as possible. You get on to Howard's. I'll get one of the street boys to run a message over. Get some tea ready, Mrs. Goodge. We'll have a meeting as soon as everyone is here." An hour later, Lucy Bell Cruikshank, accompanied by Hatchet, arrived at Upper Edmonton Gardens. The elderly white-haired American woman was grinning from ear to ear as she hurried into the kitchen. Even Hatchet, her stiff-necked and very formal butler, had the ghost of a smile on his stern face. "Good morning, everyone," Lucy cried. "Looks like we've finally got us a murder." "Really, madam," Hatchet said primly as he pulled out a chair for his employer, "it's rather unseemly to sound so happy about it. Do keep in mind that some poor soul has been foully deprived of existence." "Don't take that holier-than-thou tone with me," Lucy snapped. "I heard you chuckling to yourself when you was getting your hat. You've been grinning like a grizzly with his paw in a honey-pot all the way over here." "I'm happy about it, and I don't mind saying so," Mrs. Goodge said. She put a tea tray on the table. "I felt cheated ever since I missed that last one." Mrs. Jeffries decided it was pointless to say anything about their attitude. She could hardly blame them for their enthusiasm. After all, it was only natural that people would enjoy what they were naturally good at, and the truth was they were all born snoops. Even Mrs. Goodge, who rarely left the kitchen, contributed as much as the rest of them. Mind you, the cook did have the most incredible network of sources. Tradesmen, workers, street hawkers, and even on occasion some of her old friends, and she pumped them all ruthlessly in her search for clues. "What's this all about, then?" Lucy asked. "Perhaps we should wait until Betsy and Smythe get back," Mrs. Jeffries said. "It wouldn't be fair to start without them," Wiggins agreed. They heard the back door open, and a moment later Betsy, her nose in the air, hurried into the kitchen. Smythe was right behind her. "Sorry it took so long," she said as she took her seat. She shot the coachman a glare. "But Smythe was busy, so it took me a while to get his attention." To Mrs. Jeffries' amazement, the big burly coachman flushed. "If you'd have let me know you was standing there—" "I yelled at you 3 times," Betsy snapped. "I didn't hear you now, did I?" Please, Mrs. Jeffries had no idea what was wrong with these two. but the maid was obviously annoyed and Smythe appeared to be irritated and embarrassed. Well, whatever was wrong would just have to wait. They had a murder to solve. Do sit down and let's get started.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?